Case 623 by Danny Yu. Chapter 4. Well then, please to enlighten me. How can you possibly call this a success? The boy has no trace of the serum in him. Fine heir to the legacy of Johann Schmidt-Hillmich. The girl, Epius. Or are you so close-minded you do not believe a woman could run a fine organization? Here I believe that was the relic. A pause. Then, what would you have me do with the boy, Zola? Put him down?
How'd it go? Tony asked, walking into the living room and taking in Obi at the piano and Pepper on the couch. He crossed the room and walked straight into the nursery, picking up Jamie and bringing him back out with him. This time he noticed the pizza box. Waste. It went that bad, huh? Just because I brought pizza back from New York doesn't mean it went bad, Obi said, never ceasing his playing. Jamie blinked sleepily at the sound. Aha! Tony said, balancing Jamie on one arm so he could reach out and grab a pizza slice. Sure doesn't. The smell hit him right in the face, made him acutely aware of just how hungry he was. Oh boy. Obi finally stopped playing, getting up and walking over, casting a look down at Jamie. So the rumor spoke true for once, he said. James Stark, the board will like that at least, been clamoring for an heir for the past decade. He sighed. It would have gone better if you were there. Tony made a sound that probably served as a decent substitute for no, finished chewing his pizza and tried not to be too, hurt? What was he now, a little girl? Still, it would have been nice if Obi had given Jamie more than a moment's attention. At least the proud father in him was rather insistent on that. You told me to lay low. That's what I've been doing. I lay low when you take care of all... He put his slice down for a moment, wiped his mouth. Hey, come on. In public. The press. This was a board of directors meeting, Obi said, walking the rest of the way to join them at the table, sitting down on the recliner. Tony cocked an eyebrow, pretended to be surprised. They both knew he'd done his best to avoid those damn meetings since the first time he'd been required to attend one. This was a board of directors meeting. Then there was some exchange about injunctions and stock that Tony basically went through on autopilot as he ate and watched Jamie yawn himself awake. It didn't matter, he was working to keep the company going. He'd have the first batch of electronics prototypes ready to send off to R&D within a couple of weeks, and he and Obi had the controlling interest of the company anyway. Whatever rights the board may or may not have had, they weren't as powerful as they thought they were, and Tony sure as hell wasn't going to let them have his son's inheritance. I'm being responsible, he finally said, more than a little annoyed. That's a new direction for me, for the company. I mean, me on the company's behalf being responsible for the... He got to his feet, baby in one arm, pizza box on the other, began to make his way back towards the workshop. Oh, come on, Obi said in the condescending tone Tony had once thought of as kind and fatherly, suddenly just grated. Tony. I'll be in the shop, Tony called. Pepper, remember to give Obi the papers for the lawyers. Should have done that the moment he returned from Afghanistan. He'd just been so damn busy. Still, it was high time to get his will changed. Hey, Obi was calling, getting up to grab Tony's shoulder and turn him around, the grip just a bit too hard, and the way his grip on Jamie almost slipped just made Tony that much angrier. Tony, listen. I'm trying to turn this thing around, but you gotta give me something to pitch them. Then he was pointing at the reactor, and Tony felt distinctly uneasy in a way he rarely ever had around Obi. Let me have the engineers analyze that. You don't draw up some specs. No, Tony said. No, absolutely not. But Obi didn't even let him finish the first word uninterrupted, simply plowed on. It'll give me a bone to throw the boys in New York. Well, if Obi wasn't going to let him finish, Tony could return the favor. This one stays with me. That's it, Obi. Forget it. Have Pepper send you the specs for our new baby line or something. There was a glimmer of something on Obi's face just for a second, there and gone before Tony could quite put his finger on it. Then he was grabbing the pizza box out of Tony's hand. We really are making baby bottles. All right, well, this stays with me then. He opened the box, seeming to relent. Go on, here, you can have a piece. He'd put the smile back on his face, but it didn't look quite real. Take two, he added, even though Tony obviously lacked the free hand to do so. Thank you, Tony said, walking straight for the stairs now without bothering to turn around. You mind if I come down there and see what you're doing? Obi called. Jarvis, send him the baby line specs, Tony said. Good night, Obi. Hey, ow! Tony got out wincing, trying to direct the bots to do a slightly less painful job of getting him out of the armor. It's a tight fit, sir, Jarvis said. So the more you struggle, the more this is going to hurt. Be gentle, Tony said, grimacing as Butterfingers tugged on one of the shin pieces. Ah, that really hurt. It's my first time. I designed this to come off, so... Ow! Hey, I really should be able to... Please try not to move, sir, Jarvis said as you started in on yet another piece of the suit, and ow! Tony really was going to have to build some kind of device to help him get out of the armor more efficiently, and maybe do some redesigns so it would come off less painfully. What's going on here? Pepper asked, and Tony forced himself not to startle at the sound of her voice. He sure didn't want to make it worse than it already was. Slowly, he turned his head, took in Pepper and Jamie in her arms, giggling loudly and clapping his hands with very little coordination. For a moment, Tony struggled to find something to say because, oh no, he was going to be in the doghouse now. A single glance at Pepper's face was more than enough to confirm that. Let's face it, he said, and yeah, okay, that probably wasn't making things better. This isn't the worst thing you've caught me doing. Pepper's expression changed from disapproving to something a bit closer to horrified, or frightened perhaps. Are those bullet holes? She gave Jamie a small bounce and he squealed in response. Tony, you can't do stuff like that. What's going to happen to James if you get hurt? Tony swallowed, and yeah, he hated the thought of that, hated the fact that he'd run the risk of getting himself killed, of making his son an orphan. I'm trying to protect him, he said. Tony, that had nothing to do with protecting him, Pepper said, and her eyes were suspiciously wet now. You were on the other side of the world. That was you, wasn't it, in Gulmira? There's more than one way to protect someone, Tony said, and finally the bots finished up and he could walk over and pick up Jamie, put him on his hip, and marvel at how big he was getting, how alive and incredible and beautiful. There were weapons out there, loads of them, more than I ever could have guessed. And he was thinking about Obi now. Obi was the last thing he needed on his mind. They've all got our name on them, and every time some assholes like the Ten Rings use them, that's not just more blood on my hands, Pepper. That's another bucket load of people who learn to hate my name, to hate Jamie's name. And I don't want him to grow up with more of a target on his back than he was born with. You'd rather he grows up with strangers? Pepper asked. Tony sighed, bent to press a kiss to the top of Jamie's head. That's not going to happen, he said, loading in enough conviction to effectively shut down the argument. As Obi lowered him down onto the couch and Pepper's voice faded from his ear, Tony couldn't help but wonder how the hell everything had gone so damn wrong. Breathe, Obi was saying, his voice a horrible parody of caring. Easy, easy. He held up a device Tony recognized all too well. You remember this one, right? He wiggled the small, ill-begotten weapon Tony had been mostly drunk when designing. It's a shame the government didn't approve it. There's so many applications for causing short-term paralysis. He got up from behind Tony, which was a relief at least. The feeling of his breath on the back of his neck was beyond uncomfortable, and being defenseless was bad enough without being incapable of seeing your attacker. Cold shivers that had nothing to do with the paralysis ran down Tony's spine, and he couldn't help the fear that almost overcame him that Obi would go right down the hallway and find Jamie asleep and do what? This was all so far out of the scope of normality, made no fucking sense. What was Obi doing? Where was the man who'd given Tony a smile and a pat on the head when even his own father couldn't be bothered to pay attention to him? What even was this? Without warning, Obi gripped his jaw hard enough he'd probably leave bruises and turned Tony's head towards him. Oh, Tony. He averted his gaze for a moment, but Tony, however much he wanted to, couldn't kid himself that it was out of guilt or sympathy or anything as positive as that. Had Obi hated him all along? Had Obi's role in his whole life been an act? Or had Tony done something to push him in this direction? He couldn't even tell. A huge part of him didn't want to know. He wanted out of this situation so badly it hurt, wanted to go to the nursery, grab Jamie, and hang on, keep him safe. He should invent something, some armored weaponized pod that would assemble around Jamie in case of emergency or some crap, make sure that even if Tony got hurt, Jamie would still be alright. In front of him, Obi pulled out his earplugs. When I ordered the hit on you, he started, putting away the earplugs and leaning towards his back, and Tony felt himself go cold all over at those words, felt something inside him crack. He should have expected that by now, should have already known Obi was the enemy, had known, just hadn't realized it went this deep. All those months in that cave, the shrapnel in his chest, the torturous days he'd spent half drowned and fighting off lung infections, even Jensen, all of that was on Obi. I worried that I was killing the golden goose. Obi pulled something out of the bag, some tool, probably modified, that Tony wasn't entirely familiar with. He did something to it that made it give out a noise that sent goosebumps into bloom all over Tony's skin. But you see, Obi continued, and suddenly Tony knew exactly what the device was for. He couldn't look down, couldn't see it, but he could feel the tickle as it cut through his shirt, the pull on his scars when it closed over the arc reactor. It was just fate that you survived. Tony felt himself jolt despite the paralysis when Obi pulled the reactor free of his chest. It was still connected, the electromagnet still running, but Tony knew it wouldn't stay that way. He was not ready to die. You had one less golden egg to give. The smile on Obi's face Tony knew would stay in his nightmares for weeks if he survived that long. Do you really think that just because you have an idea, it belongs to you? Obi asked, and if Tony had had his voice, he might have asked Obi who'd failed to teach him about intellectual property and copyrights. But then again, that might be a really bad idea when the man was holding Tony's heart in his hands, and fuck, he felt better for the moment that joke had lasted. Your father, he helped give us the atomic bomb. Now what kind of world would it be today if he was as selfish as you? And Tony might have had a quib for that too, except right now he couldn't think of anything at all. Obi pulled, and Tony could feel it through his own body when the electromagnet switched off. Heard his own involuntary gasp, but fuck, how was he feeling it already? How was he supposed to last through 15 minutes of paralysis if he could already feel something moving inside his chest, shredding his insides to bits? Obi took the reactor out of his device, made a show of turning it over in his hand, admiring it as if it were just any other piece of machinery, as if it weren't the thing that was keeping Tony alive. Who did shit like this? No one would just go up to someone, rip the pacemaker out of their chest, and stare at it like it was art. Fuck, Tony had never felt so helpless in his life. Not in the cave, not when Jensen died, not when his parents and Jarvis did all those years ago, and Tony had realized he was damn near alone in the world. Oh, it's beautiful. Obi made a show of breathing, and fuck, how had Tony never seen him for the actor he was? Tony, this is your 9th symphony. Obi continued, leaning over him close enough that Tony could feel his breath on his face. Tony's stomach turned, and he wanted to get away so badly his skin crawled with it. What a masterpiece. Obi sat down next to him, and Tony could feel his arm on the backrest behind him. Hated it, fucking hated it, hated himself for all the times as a child when he'd let this bastard comfort him, when he'd let himself be tricked into thinking he had Obi in his corner. Look at that, Obi added, holding the reactor up in front of Tony's eyes, and just seeing it there was making Tony feel nauseous, making the prickling, stabbing feeling of the shrapnel moving inexorably towards his heart that much stronger, that much more acute. This is your legacy, a new generation of weapons with this at its heart. Weapons that will help steer the world back on course, put the balance of power in our hands. The right hands. Fuck, but that was scary. What kind of world would Jamie grow up in if Obi won? If Tony didn't survive this? I wish you could see my prototype, Obi continues, putting the reactor away. It's not as conservative as yours. And there was the snap of the bag closing somewhere outside Tony's line of vision. It was frighteningly final. Too bad you had to involve Pepper in this. I would have preferred that she lived, Obi said as he got to his feet, bag in hand. He began to walk towards the door. Don't worry about little James, though. I'm sure he'll have a memorable childhood in the foster system. Probably safer there than with you anyway. Oh, didn't I tell you? Those papers for legal? They were lost somewhere on the way to the offices. Maybe he'll come work for me one day. After all, your family's intelligence seems to run as deeply as your blind trust. He threw one last grin over his shoulder. Then he left, and all Tony could do was wait and hope for the paralysis to wear off before his time ran out. Keep the skies clear, he called behind him to Rhodey, what felt like half an eternity later. And keep Jamie safe. And he didn't want to go. Was damn near certain he'd end up dead, but the stain wouldn't stop before Tony was wiped out and Jamie left orphaned and destitute. But that held true whether he went or not. So as much as he wanted to crawl into a corner and hide with Jamie clutched tight in his arms, he had no choice. This way, at least, they weren't sitting around waiting for what Stain might dole out on them.